KwaZulu-Natal has certainly borne the brunt of natural disasters recently, residents having to deal with devastating floods, storms and now even a tornado a few days ago. Greenpeace says none of this is natural, but it is in fact the effects of the climate crisis and climate change. The group has come out swinging against government for defending the need for coal and also other fossil fuels. Well, let's bring into the conversation from Greenpeace Africa. It's Thandile Chinyavanhu making time for me this morning. Hello, Thandile. Good morning to you. Appreciate your time. What can government really do here? Help me understand how much of an effect these fossil fuels are having on the kind of climate we're seeing in our country. How do you put the two together?
Thank you so much for having me. First, we'd like to extend our sympathies to the communities of KZN that are experiencing these extreme weather events. I think the science is clear that extreme weather events are as a result of the climate crisis, and they're only growing in intensity and frequency. And it's important that our government recognize this and act decisively to ensure that we can bring more renewable energy online and mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions at this time to allow for us to mitigate the climate crisis and ensure that the communities are well adapted to deal with the changes that they're experiencing.
I'm seeing a lot of comments about government. Tell me how you feel about this, Thandile, that government is tone deaf, essentially, while residents are trying to rebuild their homes, rebuild their lives in Inanda and Phoenix. They get hit by another natural disaster, they do it again. But our politicians are debating whether we need fossil fuels in our future. What exactly would you like to see them do as far as government is concerned?
Yeah, well, government has been quite myopic in terms of their vision, even with the disaster response that we've seen on the ground. Just in KZN over the past couple of years and the extreme weather events that they've experienced, there's been quite a limited response in terms of what we'd like to see in terms of ensuring these communities can adapt to the changes that they're experiencing. But particularly, there's still a debate about whether or not to shift away from fossil fuels and towards more lower carbon intensive industries. And we continue to see our government the climate change bill languishing on the floors of Parliament before actually being passed. And what we'd like to see is our government making those decisive steps to ratify the climate change bill and ensure that we can move forward and start to compel these heavy emitters to actually reduce their emissions and ensure that we're able to mitigate further damage from occurring.
Because obviously South Africa, every time COP comes around, COP27 or whatever year it might actually be in the end as well, always tends to say the same thing. But it's difficult. I don't get a sense that government really is taking this all that seriously as well, because there's just so many other issues the country is dealing with, whether it's poverty, unemployment, a lack of clean drinking water, not to mention blackouts, crime. I can keep going, but we've only got a couple of minutes. Where do you think this sits on the priority list?
It's understandable that there are a number of frustrating issues that South Africans are being plagued with right now, as you mentioned, particularly load shedding. But the government reneging on their commitments, their climate commitments, and wanting to double down on its coal use is particularly a concerning scenario that we're faced with. But we've had 15 years to rectify this issue with load shedding. And it's important that the government recognize the potential of renewable energy to be able to alleviate some of the energy issues that we're dealing with right now. Just looking at the trends at Eskom, wind has been able to contribute a significant amount of power to the grid, and it's been able to affect our stages of load shedding by decreasing them quite significantly. And it's important that they recognize the power of this and invest a lot more into renewable energy, as it could potentially alleviate some of the energy issues we're seeing. So we just need to see a lot more political will from our government and recognition of these technologies to be able to assist us.
You've brought in the point of coal quite a couple of times, Thandile, so it would be remiss of me not to ask then. Right now, do you see it's a choice of either, as a country, we continue with fossil fuels and we get out of load shedding, because by doing that, we could focus on getting our diesel generators up and running properly, serviced and maintained properly, also our coal-fired power stations, get those up and running to get us out of blackouts? Or should the focus be on the environment and climate change? I get the sense we can't have both, or can we?
It is quite possible to have both, and that's what Greenpeace Africa has been campaigning for us, our government to recognize that we can have power and we can live in an environment, that we can live harmoniously in our environment and not cause further damage. The reality is that in the Highveld region, many people are suffering as a result of the air pollution. For us to just be able to have electricity as a country, and we cannot overlook these areas and consider them sacrifice zones. People that are living in these areas are experiencing cardiovascular disease, neurological disorders as a result of the emissions in these areas. And it's important that we recognize them and that we find alternatives that can allow us to live in more safe environments while also being able to enjoy access to electricity. And it is quite possible to have both.
How do we try and get the electorate ahead of the 2024 elections to really understand how dangerous climate change actually is? I think there would be very few people who are arguing against the concept of climate change these days, considering what we're seeing on the news on a global scale. How do we try and get the ordinary person to understand just what the devastating effects are currently? And I suppose, I don't want to go as far as being too dramatic, but a doomsday scenario.
Well, climate change is going to impact everyone. No one will be insulated against the impacts of these extreme weather events. And the reality is that it does need to be something that is considered in the top of the mind of the voters. We need to increase voter education, particularly around the impacts of climate change and how it's going to be affecting them as individuals, both in urban and rural areas. There are devastating impacts of climate change. So we need to see our governments as well, our government taking this as a priority, the different political parties putting this on their manifestos and ensuring that these are conversations that are being had.
Thandile, thank you very much indeed. I appreciate your time. It's a conversation we're going to continue to have, of course, because what we're seeing down in KZN and around the country at the moment. Thandile